A tear rolled down Malik Hayes's cheek as he clutched a crumpled drawing in his trembling hands. His voice, small but filled with desperation, broke through the tense air. "Please, I promised my mum I'd bring this to her." Evelyn Harper's cold gaze swept over him, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "Rules are rules, young man. Go home before I call security." The words hit like a slap, but Malik didn't move. His small frame shook, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. Across the room, Brianna Carter froze, her heart pounding. The injustice of the moment was suffocating, but stepping in meant risking everything. "That's enough, Evelyn." Brianna's voice cut through the tension. "This is a child, not a problem." Evelyn turned, her voice as icy as her glare. "And you're not a hero, Brianna. Compassion won't save you when you're out of a job." Inside a quiet hospital room, Malik's voice cracked as he whispered to his mother, "I made this for you, Mom. I walked all this way." Corinne Hayes, frail but smiling, clutched the drawing like it was her lifeline. "You're my sunshine, Malik. Always." But just outside, Evelyn muttered under her breath, her words dripping with disdain. "People like her. They think they deserve the world handed to them." The storm intensified when Dr. Jonathan Moore confronted Evelyn. His voice was calm, but his words sliced through her defenses. "Do you even remember where you came from, Evelyn Davis? Corinne Hayes believed in you when no one else did, and this is how you repay her." Evelyn froze, her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I don't owe her anything," she said, but her voice wavered. Jonathan's reply was sharp, unyielding. "You owe her everything." Kindness can transform lives, and small acts often make the biggest difference. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone's compassion changed everything? Are you watching this story from a bustling city, a peaceful suburb, or somewhere in between? We'd love to know. What does kindness look like in your community? Have you seen or heard about moments that remind you of how important it is to stand up for others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're here, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us for more inspiring and heartwarming stories that bring people together. Together, let's build a community where kindness always shines. The hum of activity echoed through the halls of Atlanta Mercy General Hospital as nurses, doctors, and staff moved swiftly between patient rooms. The fluorescent lights cast a stark glow over the pristine white floors, while the air carried a sterile yet oddly comforting scent. For most, this was just another bustling day, but for Evelyn Harper, it was a stage. A place where her impeccable professionalism shone on the surface, concealing the jagged edges of her prejudiced heart. Evelyn, a seasoned nurse in her mid-30s, strode purposefully through the corridor, her pressed uniform crisp and spotless. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a bun, and her soft-spoken demeanor often garnered compliments from patients and colleagues alike. Yet behind her pleasant smile lay a mind constantly at work, calculating, judging, and compartmentalizing every interaction. As she stopped to check a patient's chart, her gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary. It was a middle-aged black man awaiting surgery for a fractured hip. Her expression remained neutral, but her thoughts betrayed her. Why do they always seem to end up here? Poor decisions, no doubt. With a practiced smile, she addressed the patient briefly, her words polite but devoid of warmth. The man thanked her softly, his voice trembling with the vulnerability of someone placing their trust in strangers. Evelyn turned and walked away, her heels clicking on the floor, not giving his gratitude a second thought. At the nurses' station, Evelyn crossed paths with Brianna Carter, a young black nurse in her first year of training. Brianna's energy and optimism were a sharp contrast to Evelyn's carefully maintained cynicism. While Evelyn avoided certain patients, Brianna eagerly volunteered to assist anyone who needed care, often going out of her way to ensure they felt seen and valued. "Evelyn," Brianna greeted warmly, her bright eyes glinting with hope. "Do you need help with the intake forms for the new patients?" Evelyn's smile was polite but thin. "Thank you, Brianna, but I've got it handled. Focus on your tasks for now." Her tone was dismissive, and Brianna hesitated, sensing an unspoken wall between them. It wasn't the first time. Evelyn's condescension often masked subtle undertones that Brianna couldn't ignore. But Brianna, ever gracious, nodded and returned to her duties. Later that morning, Evelyn found herself in Sandra Blake's office. The hospital's no-nonsense administrator was reviewing patient flow data while Evelyn waited, perfectly poised in her chair. "I wanted to discuss our intake procedures," Evelyn began, her voice calm and measured. "There have been increasing incidents of, disruptions from patients who come from less stable environments. Perhaps we could tighten security around certain areas to ensure everyone's safety." Sandra glanced up, her sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. She had worked with Evelyn long enough to recognize the coded language buried in her suggestions. "Evelyn," Sandra replied evenly, "our procedures are in place to serve everyone equally, regardless of their background. Disruptions, as you call them, don't seem to be a recurring issue." Evelyn's lips tightened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, Sandra. I just want to ensure the hospital remains a safe space for staff and patients alike." Sandra nodded curtly, signaling the end of the conversation. Evelyn rose and left the office, her frustration masked by the same polished exterior she always presented. Across the hospital, Dr. Jonathan Moore, a distinguished physician in his 50s, was making rounds. His years of experience had made him not only skilled, but deeply empathetic, a quality that set him apart. In the break room, he found Brianna taking a quick sip of water, her shoulders slightly slumped from the morning rush. "Long morning?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle. Brianna straightened and managed a smile. "Nothing I can't handle, but some days it feels like you're trying to swim upstream." Jonathan nodded knowingly. "The system doesn't always make it easy. But remember, Brianna, our job is more than treating symptoms. It's about healing wounds that run deeper than what we see on the surface." His words struck a chord with Brianna. She admired Jonathan's ability to balance compassion with professionalism, and she silently vowed to embody the same ethos. Later in the afternoon, Evelyn encountered a nurse assisting an elderly black woman in a wheelchair. The patient's chart was misplaced, causing a minor delay in her admission. Evelyn seized the opportunity to step in, her tone clipped but outwardly professional. "This is why we must be more vigilant," Evelyn said, addressing the other nurse but loud enough for the patient to hear. "We can't afford inefficiencies when resources are stretched so thin." The elderly woman looked down, her dignity bruised. Evelyn didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care. She swiftly walked away, leaving the other nurse scrambling to console the patient. By evening, the tension that Evelyn carried seemed to ripple through the hospital. Staff whispered about her behind closed doors, while patients occasionally exchanged nervous glances in her presence. But Evelyn remained oblivious, her focus solely on maintaining the image of a nurse who had everything under control. In the staff room, Brianna shared her concerns with Jonathan. "Dr. Moore, do you ever feel like some people here see patients as problems to manage instead of lives to care for?" Jonathan sighed deeply. "Brianna, there will always be those who let their fears and prejudices guide them. But it's our responsibility to rise above it, to be the difference." As the day drew to a close, Evelyn stood at the nurses' station, observing the controlled chaos around her. She reveled in the sense of order she believed she maintained, blind to the quiet unrest she sowed. In her mind, She was the pillar of efficiency, the model of what a nurse should be. But cracks had begun to form in her carefully constructed facade. Unbeknownst to her, the wheels of change had already been set in motion, and the day when she would be forced to confront her own reflection was fast approaching. For now, Evelyn remained secure in her illusion, unaware that the very foundation she stood on was about to crumble. The sun had barely risen over the city of Atlanta, casting a golden haze over the dilapidated buildings and narrow streets of Malik Hayes's neighborhood. The air was heavy with the scent of rain from the night before, and the faint sounds of early morning traffic hummed in the distance. This was home for Malik, a place that bore the weight of poverty, but also the warmth of a mother's love. Malik, a 10-year-old with deep brown eyes that seemed far older than his years, sat cross-legged on the worn couch in their small living room. His hands worked diligently, coloring in the final touches of a drawing he had spent hours on. The picture was simple, a bright yellow sun shining down on a field of flowers with the words, "I love you, Mom," written in bold, childlike letters at the top. His mother, Corinne Hayes, had always told him that the simplest gestures carried the most meaning. This drawing was his gesture, his way of trying to bring a little light to the dreariness of their lives. Corinne had been admitted to Atlanta Mercy General Hospital 3 days ago, her body weakened after years of long shifts cleaning office buildings. Malik hadn't been able to visit her yet, and it weighed on him like a stone. As he stared at the drawing, Malik's mind wandered back to the night before she was taken to the hospital. Corinne had been pale and unsteady, her usual resilience worn thin. She had knelt in front of him, resting a trembling hand on his cheek. "Malik," she had said softly, her voice a mix of exhaustion and love. "Promise me you'll always be kind, even when the world isn't. That's how we make it better." Today, Malik was determined to keep his promise, not just to be kind, but to be strong. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it into his backpack alongside a sandwich wrapped in plastic. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer. Their neighborhood, Pinewood Terrace, wasn't the kind of place you lingered in after dark. The paint peeled off the walls of the brick apartment buildings, and the sidewalks were cracked and uneven. But it was familiar, and Malik navigated it with the ease of someone who knew which corners to avoid and which shortcuts would save him time. As he stepped outside, Malik glanced back at the window of their apartment. For a brief moment, he imagined his mother standing there, waving at him like she used to when he left for school. The memory gave him a small surge of courage as he tightened the straps on his backpack and began his journey to the hospital. The walk was long, nearly 5 miles, but Malik had no other choice. Bus fare was out of the question. Their limited funds were being stretched thin to cover Corinne's medical bills. Malik had overheard the landlord's threats about overdue rent and knew that every penny mattered. As he made his way down Jefferson Street, he passed a group of teenagers loitering near a corner store. They eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Malik kept his head down, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. One of them called out, "Hey, little man, where you off to so early?" Malik didn't answer. He quickened his pace, his small frame weaving through the maze of potholes and trash bins that dotted the street. He didn't stop until he turned the corner, where he let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not long after, Malik reached the park that marked the halfway point of his journey. The dew on the grass sparkled in the morning light, and the sound of birds chirping offered a brief reprieve from the weight on his shoulders. Sitting on a bench was Mr. Charles Green, a retired veteran who lived in the same building as Malik and his mother. "Morning, Malik," Mr. Green greeted, his gravelly voice warm and familiar. "What brings you out so early, son?" Malik hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. "I'm going to see my mom at the hospital," he admitted, his voice quiet but resolute. Mr. Green nodded thoughtfully, his weathered hands resting on his cane. "Your mama's a strong woman. She's got more fight in her than most folks I've met. He paused, his gaze steady. You know, Malik, sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight with our fists. They're the ones we fight with our hearts. You remember that, all right? Yes, sir, Malik replied, his voice stronger now. I'll remember. Mr. Green reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single wrapped caramel candy. Here, he said with a small smile, a little fuel for the journey. Malik grinned for the first time that morning, tucking the candy into his pocket. Thank you, Mr. Green. As Malik continued on his way, the buildings around him began to change. The graffiti-covered walls gave way to sleek office towers, and the sidewalks became cleaner, smoother. The closer he got to the hospital, the more out of place he felt. His scuffed sneakers and worn backpack stood in stark contrast to the polished shoes and tailored suits of the people rushing past him. When the towering silhouette of Atlanta Mercy General came into view, Malik's heart quickened. The building was a symbol of hope and fear all at once, a place where lives were saved, but also where truths too heavy for a child to bear were often revealed. By the time Malik reached the hospital entrance, his legs ached and his throat was dry. But he pushed forward, his mother's face in his mind and the promise of her love in his heart. As he stepped through the glass doors, the cool air of the lobby enveloped him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun outside. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he clutched the straps of his backpack tightly and whispered to himself, I can do this. For Mom. The lobby of Atlanta. Mercy General Hospital bustled with its usual symphony of sound. Heels clicking against the polished floor, muffled voices blending with the distant hum of machinery and the soft rustling of papers being shuffled behind the reception desk. It was a space designed to inspire calm and order, but for 10-year-old Malik Hayes, it felt overwhelming. The imposing glass walls and marble floors made him feel small, as if he were an uninvited guest in a place far removed from the familiar chaos of Pinewood Terrace. Clutching the straps of his backpack, Malik approached the large reception desk. His heart raced as he rehearsed his words silently. Excuse me, I'm here to see my mum. Her name is Corinne Hayes. He whispered it under his breath again, willing himself to speak with confidence. Behind the desk sat Evelyn Harper, her blonde hair swept neatly into a bun and her pale blue uniform pristine. She was reviewing patient files on the computer, her expression one of practiced indifference. Malik hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, standing on tiptoe to reach the counter. Excuse me, ma'am, Malik began, his voice small but steady. I'm here to see my mum. Her name is Corinne Hayes. She's in room... Evelyn's head turned slowly, her gaze falling on Malik like a shadow. She sized him up in an instant. His two large sneakers, the frayed straps of his backpack, the nervous energy in his eyes. Her lips curled into a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Visiting hours for minors are restricted, she said curtly, cutting him off. You'll need an adult to accompany you. But, Malik faltered, gripping the edge of the counter. I walked here by myself. My mum's been here for days, and I just want to see her. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with a polite disdain that masked her growing irritation. Rules are rules, young man. This is a hospital, not a playground. We can't make exceptions for everyone who decides to show up unaccompanied. Malik's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the folded drawing he had worked so hard on. Holding it up like a shield, he said, I made this for her. She's sick, and I just want to give it to her. Please. For a brief moment, Evelyn's gaze flickered to the drawing, a burst of yellow and green crayon radiating hope and love. But the moment passed quickly, her face hardening once more. This isn't about what you want, she said coldly. It's about keeping patients safe. If we let you in, we'd have to let every child in, wouldn't we? And that would cause chaos. Her words were firm, but her tone carried an edge that cut deeper than necessary. Malik's fingers trembled as he lowered the drawing, his voice cracking. "But I promised her." Promises meant something to Malik. His mother had always taught him that words mattered, and breaking a promise was something you only did when you had no other choice. But Evelyn seemed immune to such sentiments. To her, this was just another interaction in a long day of managing what she saw as petty inconveniences. A silence hung between them, broken only by the distant beeping of monitors. Malik looked down at his shoes, his mind racing for what to do next. He had come so far, walked so many miles, and now he was being turned away like a stranger. "Can't you just ask someone?" Malik tried again, desperation seeping into his tone. "She needs to see me. I know she does." Evelyn sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Look, kid," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "People like your mother don't get special treatment here. Now go home before I call security." The words hit Malik like a punch to the gut. His eyes welled with tears, but he blinked them back, refusing to let her see him cry. He turned away from the desk, clutching the drawing tightly in his hands, and stumbled toward a bench near the entrance. Sitting down, he felt the weight of the day crush him, the promise he had made to his mother slipping further out of reach. Evelyn, meanwhile, resumed her work as if nothing had happened, her polished demeanor firmly back in place. To her, Malik was just another disruption in a day filled with them. Malik sat on the hard bench near the entrance, his shoulders slumped as he stared at the crumpled drawing in his hands. The bright colors that once felt so full of hope now seemed muted and distant. He couldn't bring himself to cry, not here, where the polished floors and clinical air seemed to swallow every emotion. The world around him blurred into a distant hum, the sound of voices at the reception desk, the faint whir of automatic doors, the occasional hurried footsteps of staff moving through the lobby. Malik was too defeated to notice when a shadow fell over him. "Hey there, are you okay?" The soft voice startled him, and he looked up to see a young nurse with kind eyes and a warm smile. Brianna Carter crouched down to meet him at eye level, her uniform slightly wrinkled after a long shift. There was no judgment in her gaze, only genuine concern. Malik hesitated, clutching the drawing tighter. "They won't let me see my mum," he whispered. "She's really sick and I walked all the way here. I just want to give her this." Brianna's heart twisted as she glanced at the drawing, a simple yet heartfelt gesture that spoke volumes about the bond between Malik and his mother. She glanced toward the reception desk, where Evelyn was busy typing on her computer, her expression impassive. Brianna had worked with Evelyn long enough to recognize her brand of quiet cruelty, and it fueled something fierce within her. "She's in this hospital?" Brianna asked gently. Malik nodded. "Room 317. Brianna's smile softened, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. "Wait here for just a minute, okay?" She rose to her feet and walked to the reception desk, her steps steady and purposeful. Evelyn barely looked up as Brianna approached. "Evelyn?" Brianna began, keeping her tone even. "The boy sitting over there. His mom is in room 317. Can we make an exception and let him visit her? He's come all this way by himself." Evelyn let out a quiet scoff, her fingers pausing briefly over the keyboard. "We have rules for a reason, Brianna. If we let one child in, they'll all want in. It's about maintaining order." "It's about showing compassion," Brianna countered, her voice firm but not unkind. "He's just a kid, Evelyn. His mom is sick and all he wants is to see her." Evelyn finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You're new here, Brianna. Let me give you a piece of advice. Don't get too attached. This is a hospital, not a charity." Brianna's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "Sometimes being a nurse means more than following rules. It means doing the right thing, Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression icy. "If you want to risk your job over this, be my guest, but don't expect me to clean up your mess." Brianna's stomach churned at the veiled threat, but she refused to let it deter her. She turned back toward Malik, her resolve hardening. "Come with me," she said softly, holding out her hand. Malik hesitated for only a moment before slipping his small hand into hers. Together, they walked past the reception desk, Malik's heart pounding as they approached the elevators. The ride to the third floor felt both impossibly long and too fast. Malik clutched the drawing to his chest, his nerves fraying with each passing second. When the elevator doors slid open, Brianna guided him down the quiet co. Inside, Corinne Hayes lay propped up on a hospital bed, her complexion pale, but her eyes still bright with the determination that had carried her through so much. When she saw Malik step into the room, her face broke into a smile so wide it seemed to light up the sterile space. "Malik," she breathed, her voice trembling with both surprise and joy. Malik rushed to her side, carefully placing the drawing in her hands. "I made this for you, Mum," he said, his voice quivering. "I promised I'd bring it to you." Tears welled in Corinne's eyes as she looked at the drawing, her fingers tracing the words her son had written. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Just like you." For a moment, the world outside the room disappeared. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it faded in the warmth of their reunion. Brianna stood quietly by the door, giving them the space they needed while silently vowing to protect moments like these, no matter the cost. But the quiet was short-lived. As Brianna stepped into the hallway, she caught sight of Evelyn rounding the corner, her expression a mix of annoyance and triumph. Brianna's pulse quickened, but she refused to let fear take hold. "What are you doing?" Evelyn hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You're jeopardizing your position and this hospital's reputation." Brianna straightened her shoulders, meeting Evelyn's glare with calm defiance. "I'm doing my job, caring for people. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of Corinne's soft laughter drifted into the hallway, cutting through the tension like sunlight breaking through clouds. For a moment, even Evelyn faltered, her rigid expression flickering with something almost human. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the steely mask she always wore. "We'll see how long you last here," she said coldly, turning on her heel and marching back toward the reception desk. Brianna exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. She looked back into the room where Malik was holding his mother's hand, their bond unbroken despite everything they had endured. It gave her strength. Malik sat on the cold bench just outside the hospital lobby, his hands clutching the crumpled drawing he'd worked so hard on. He stared at the polished floor beneath his feet, the gleam of it mocking the roughness of his worn sneakers. His chest felt tight, his heart heavy with disappointment. Every step of his long journey had been fueled by hope. Hope that he'd see his mother, that he'd bring her a little piece of joy. Now, it felt like all of it had been for nothing. The sound of laughter and hurried footsteps swirled around him, the bustle of the hospital continuing without pause. Malik felt invisible, as though he were just another part of the furniture, something unnoticed and unimportant. He tried to stay strong, blinking away the tears that threatened to spill, but it was getting harder with every passing second. "Hey there, kiddo. You okay?" The voice was soft but steady, cutting through the fog of Malik's sadness like a ray of light. He looked up, startled, to see a young woman standing in front of him. She wore a nurse's uniform, and her warm smile was a stark contrast to the cold indifference he'd faced earlier. Her name badge read Brianna Carter, but what struck Malik most were her eyes, kind, curious, and filled with genuine concern. Malik hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of his drawing. They won't let me see my mum, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. She's sick, and I just wanted to give this to her. Brianna crouched down so that she was at eye level with him. Your mum's here in the hospital, she asked gently. He nodded, his voice trembling. Room 317. I walked here by myself. I wanted to see her. For a moment, Brianna said nothing, her expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, a mix of empathy and quiet anger. She glanced at the drawing Malik held, its bright colors smudged from the tight grip of his hands. It was a simple picture, but its meaning was clear: love, hope, and a determination that shouldn't have been placed on the shoulders of a 10-year-old. What's your name? She asked softly. Malik, he replied. Well, Malik, Brianna said, standing up and holding out her hand, how about we see if we can get you to your mum? Malik blinked at her, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Really? She nodded, her smile unwavering. Really? Come on. The hallway leading to the patient rooms was quieter than the lobby, the soft beeping of machines and occasional murmurs of nurses creating an almost serene atmosphere. Malik walked beside Brianna, clutching his backpack as if it were a lifeline. Every step felt both exciting and terrifying. He was closer to seeing his mother, but the fear of being turned away again lingered. Brianna glanced down at Malik as they approached room 317. So, you made that drawing for your mum? She asked, breaking the silence. Malik nodded. She loves flowers, and she always says the sun makes everything better. I thought maybe it could help her feel better. Brianna's heart ached at his words. She smiled at him, a quiet reassurance that he was doing something truly special. I'm sure it'll mean the world to her. When they reached the door, Brianna stopped and knelt down in front of Malik. Okay, here's the deal. We're going to go in quietly, and you can surprise her with that masterpiece of yours. Sound good? Malik nodded again, his nervousness giving way to anticipation. Brianna opened the door slowly, and they stepped inside. The room was small but bright, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting a soft glow over the bed where Corinne Hayes lay. She looked pale and tired, her frame frail against the stark white sheets. But the moment her eyes landed on Malik, everything about her seemed to change. Her face lit up with a smile so radiant that it chased away the fatigue, if only for a moment. Malik, she breathed, her voice trembling with joy and surprise. Mom! Malik ran to her side, the drawing clutched tightly in his hands. He hesitated for a moment, then carefully placed it on her lap. I made this for you. Corinne's hands shook as she picked up the drawing, her fingers tracing the bright, childlike lines of the sun and flowers. Tears welled in her eyes, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. It's beautiful, she whispered, looking up at her son. Thank you, baby. It's perfect. Malik climbed onto the chair beside her bed, his small hand reaching for hers. I promised I'd bring it to you, Mom, he said softly. I walked all the way here. Corinne's tears spilled over as she held his hand tightly, her heart swelling with a mix of pride, love, and sorrow. You're my sunshine, Malik, she said, her voice breaking. You always have been. Brianna stood quietly by the door, giving them space but unable to stop the lump that formed in her throat. She had seen countless reunions during her time as a nurse, but something about this one felt different, raw, pure, and deeply human. She knew she had made the right choice in helping Malik, no matter what consequences might follow. When it was time for Brianna and Malik to leave, Corinne's gaze lingered on the young nurse. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with sincerity. I don't know how to repay you for this. You don't have to repay me, Brianna replied, her smile soft but resolute. Just focus on getting better, Malik needs you." As they stepped back into the hallway, Malik turned to Brianna, his eyes wide with gratitude. "Thank you for helping me," he said. "You're the best." Brianna crouched down again, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're pretty amazing yourself, Malik. Don't ever forget that." For the first time in days, Malik smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. And as Brianna watched him walk toward the exit, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had played a small part in keeping the promise he had made to his mother. The faint hum of fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway seemed louder than usual, an ominous backdrop to the tension building in the air. Brianna Carter stood just outside the break room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The confrontation she knew was coming had been looming since the moment she helped Malik see his mother. And now, it was here. Evelyn Harper had made sure of that. Inside the break room, Evelyn sat at the corner table, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line of barely concealed disdain. A cup of untouched coffee sat in front of her, the steam curling lazily into the air. Across from her was Sandra Blake, the hospital administrator, her expression unreadable, but her sharp blue eyes locked on Evelyn. Brianna entered hesitantly, her steps slow but deliberate. "Brianna," Sandra greeted her, gesturing to the chair across from Evelyn. "Please, take a seat." Brianna swallowed hard and did as she was told, feeling Evelyn's cold gaze settle on her like a physical weight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before Sandra finally broke it. "Evelyn has brought to my attention a breach in protocol," Sandra began, her voice measured. "Specifically regarding a patient's minor son being allowed access to a restricted area. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Brianna's chest tightened, but she refused to let fear dictate her response. She sat up straighter, meeting Sandra's gaze with as much composure as she could muster. "Malik Hayes walked miles to see his mother, who is in critical condition," she explained. "He had no one else to help him. I couldn't let him sit out there, alone and scared, when all he wanted was to give her a drawing he made." The elderly woman looked down, her dignity bruised. Evelyn didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care. She swiftly walked away, leaving the other nurse scrambling to console the patient. By evening, the tension that Evelyn carried seemed to ripple through the hospital. Staff whispered about her behind closed doors, while patients occasionally exchanged nervous glances in her presence. But Evelyn remained oblivious, her focus solely on maintaining the image of a nurse who had everything under control. In the staff room, Brianna shared her concerns with Jonathan. "Dr. Moore, do you ever feel like some people here see patients as problems to manage instead of lives to care for?" Jonathan sighed deeply. "Brianna, there will always be those who let their fears and prejudices guide them, but it's our responsibility to rise above it, to be the difference." As the day drew to a close, Evelyn stood at the nurses' station, observing the controlled chaos around her. She reveled in the sense of order she believed she maintained, blind to the quiet unrest she sowed. In her mind, she was the pillar of efficiency, the model of what a nurse should be. But cracks had begun to form in her carefully constructed facade. Unbeknownst to her, the wheels of change had already been set in motion, and the day when she would be forced to confront her own reflection was fast approaching. For now, Evelyn remained secure in her illusion, unaware that the very foundation she stood on was about to crumble. The sun had barely risen over the city of Atlanta, casting a golden haze over the dilapidated buildings and narrow streets of Malik Hayes' neighborhood. The air was heavy with the scent of rain from the night before, and the faint sounds of early morning traffic hummed in the distance. This was home for Malik, a place that bore the weight of poverty, but also the warmth of a mother's love. Malik, A 10-year-old with deep brown eyes that seemed far older than his years sat cross-legged on the worn couch in their small living room. His hands worked diligently, coloring in the final touches of a drawing he had spent hours on. The picture was simple, a bright yellow sun shining down on a field of flowers with the words, "I love you, Mom," written in bold, childlike letters at the top. His mother, Corinne Hayes, had always told him that the simplest gestures carried the most meaning. This drawing was his gesture, his way of trying to bring a little light to the dreariness of their lives. Corinne had been admitted to Atlanta Mercy General Hospital 3 days ago, her body weakened after years of long shifts cleaning office buildings. Malik hadn't been able to visit her yet, and it weighed on him like a stone. As he stared at the drawing, Malik's mind wandered back to the night before she was taken to the hospital. Corinne had been pale and unsteady, her usual resilience worn thin. She had knelt in front of him, resting a trembling hand on his cheek. "Malik," she had said softly, her voice a mix of exhaustion and love. "Promise me you'll always be kind, even when the world isn't. That's how we make it better." Today, Malik was determined to keep his promise, not just to be kind, but to be strong. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it into his backpack alongside a sandwich wrapped in plastic. It wasn't much, but it was all he had to offer. Their neighborhood, Pinewood Terrace, wasn't the kind of place you lingered in after dark. The paint peeled off the walls of the brick apartment buildings, and the sidewalks were cracked and uneven. But it was familiar, and Malik navigated it with the ease of someone who knew which corners to avoid and which shortcuts would save him time. As he stepped outside, Malik glanced back at the window of their apartment. For a brief moment, he imagined his mother standing there, waving at him like she used to when he left for school. The memory gave him a small surge of courage as he tightened the straps on his backpack and began his journey to the hospital. The walk was long, nearly 5 miles, but Malik had no other choice. Bus fare was out of the question. Their limited funds were being stretched thin to cover Corinne's medical bills. Malik had overheard the landlord's threats about overdue rent and knew that every penny mattered. As he made his way down Jefferson Street, he passed a group of teenagers loitering near a corner store. They eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Malik kept his head down, clutching the straps of his backpack tightly. One of them called out, "Hey, little man, where you off to so early?" Malik didn't answer. He quickened his pace, his small frame weaving through the maze of potholes and trash bins that dotted the street. He didn't stop until he turned the corner, where he let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Not long after, Malik reached the park that marked the halfway point of his journey. The dew on the grass sparkled in the morning light, and the sound of birds chirping offered a brief reprieve from the weight on his shoulders. Sitting on a bench was Mr. Charles Green, a retired veteran who lived in the same building as Malik and his mother. "Morning, Malik," Mr. Green greeted, his gravelly voice warm and familiar. "What brings you out so early, son?" Malik hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. "I'm going to see my mum at the hospital," he admitted, his voice quiet but resolute. Mr. Green nodded thoughtfully, his weathered hands resting on his cane. "Your mama's a strong woman. She's got more fight in her than most folks I've met." He paused, his gaze steady. "You know, Malik, sometimes the hardest battles aren't the ones we fight with our fists. They're the ones we fight with our hearts. You remember that, all right?" "Yes, sir," Malik replied, his voice stronger now. "I'll remember." Mr. Green reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a single wrapped caramel candy. "Here," he said with a small smile, "a little fuel for the journey." Malik grinned for the first time that morning, tucking the candy into his pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Green." As Malik continued on his way, the buildings around him began to change. The graffiti-covered walls gave way to sleek office towers, and the sidewalks became cleaner, smoother. The closer he got to the hospital, the more out of place he felt. His scuffed sneakers and worn backpack stood in stark contrast to the polished shoes and tailored suits of the people rushing past him. When the towering silhouette of Atlanta Mercy General came into view, Malik's heart quickened. The building was a symbol of hope and fear all at once, a place where lives were saved, but also where truths too heavy for a child to bear were often revealed. By the time Malik reached the hospital entrance, his legs ached and his throat was dry. But he pushed forward, his mother's face in his mind and the promise of her love in his heart. As he stepped through the glass doors, the cool air of the lobby enveloped him, a stark contrast to the warmth of the sun outside. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he clutched the straps of his backpack tightly and whispered to himself, "I can do this." For Mom. The lobby of Atlanta. Mercy General Hospital bustled with its usual symphony of sound, heels clicking against the polished floor, muffled voices blending with the distant hum of machinery and the soft rustling of papers being shuffled behind the reception desk. It was a space designed to inspire calm and order, but for 10-year-old Malik Hayes, it felt overwhelming. The imposing glass walls and marble floors made him feel small, as if he were an uninvited guest in a place far removed from the familiar chaos of Pinewood Terrace. Clutching the straps of his backpack, Malik approached the large reception desk. His heart raced as he rehearsed his words silently. "Excuse me, I'm here to see my mum. Her name is Corinne Hayes." He whispered it under his breath again, willing himself to speak with confidence. Behind the desk sat Evelyn Harper, her blonde hair swept neatly into a bun and her pale blue uniform pristine. She was reviewing patient files on the computer, her expression one of practiced indifference. Malik hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, standing on tiptoe to reach the counter. "Excuse me, ma'am," Malik began, his voice small but steady. "I'm here to see my mum. Her name is Corinne Hayes. She's in room—" Evelyn's head turned slowly, her gaze falling on Malik like a shadow. She sized him up in an instant. His two large sneakers, the frayed straps of his backpack, the nervous energy in his eyes. Her lips curled into a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Visiting hours for minors are restricted," she said curtly, cutting him off. "You'll need an adult to accompany you." "But," Malik faltered, gripping the edge of the counter, "I walked here by myself. My mum's been here for days, and I just want to see her." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with a polite disdain that masked her growing irritation. "Rules are rules, young man. This is a hospital, not a playground. We can't make exceptions for everyone who decides to show up unaccompanied." Malik's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the folded drawing he had worked so hard on. Holding it up like a shield, he said, "I made this for her. She's sick, and I just want to give it to her. Please." For a brief moment, Evelyn's gaze flickered to the drawing, a burst of yellow and green crayon radiating hope and love. But the moment passed quickly, her face hardening once more. "This isn't about what you want," she said coldly. "It's about keeping patients safe. If we let you in, we'd have to let every child in, wouldn't we? And that would cause chaos." "Corinne Hayes," Jonathan murmured to himself, his voice heavy with realization. He remembered the stories Corinne had shared during her early days as a janitor at the hospital, tales of the students she had mentored in her old neighborhood. Could Evelyn Harper, poised, rigid, and full of quiet prejudice, have been one of them? Jonathan decided to speak directly with Corinne, feeling a responsibility to understand the connection. He found her in her hospital room, resting but alert. Malik was at her side, engrossed in a book he had brought from home. When Jonathan entered, Corinne offered a weak smile. "Dr. Moore," she said, her voice soft but steady. "To what do I owe this visit?" Jonathan took a seat, his tone gentle. "Corinne, I wanted to ask you about something. It's about Evelyn Harper." At the mention of the name, a shadow passed over Corinne's face. She adjusted her position in the bed, her expression guarded. "What about her?" she asked carefully. Jonathan hesitated, not wanting to push too hard. "I was reviewing some files and noticed that Evelyn grew up in the same neighborhood you used to teach in. I was wondering if you knew her." Corinne sighed, her gaze drifting toward the window. "I knew her," she said after a long pause. "Back then, she wasn't Evelyn Harper. She was Evelyn Davis." Corinne's voice took on a reflective tone as she recounted the story. Evelyn had been one of her brightest students, intelligent, determined, and full of potential. But she had also been deeply insecure, constantly wrestling with the stigma of growing up in poverty. She was ashamed, Corinne explained, her eyes distant as she delved into the past. Ashamed of where she came from, of who she was. She wanted so badly to fit into a world that didn't see value in girls like her. Corinne paused, her hands tightening around the blanket. "I tried to help her. I tutored her after school, gave her encouragement when no one else would. But somewhere along the way, she started seeing my help as a weakness, like it was proof that she wasn't good enough on her own." Jonathan listened intently, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Do you think that's why she resents you now?" he asked gently. Corinne nodded. "She's spent her whole life trying to erase where she came from, and I'm a reminder of everything she's trying to forget." The next day, Jonathan confronted Evelyn directly. He found her in the break room, sipping her coffee with the same composed detachment she always carried. When he entered, she glanced up briefly before returning to her drink. "Dr. Moore," she greeted coolly. "What can I do for you?" Jonathan didn't waste time. "I spoke with Corinne Hayes yesterday." At the mention of Corinne's name, Evelyn's grip on her coffee cup tightened, her knuckles turning white, but her expression remained neutral. "And?" Jonathan leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "She told me about your past, about how she helped you when no one else would." Evelyn set her cup down, her movements slow and deliberate. "That was a long time ago," she said flatly. "It's irrelevant now." "I don't think it is," Jonathan countered, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're holding on to something, Evelyn, something that's affecting the way you treat people, and it's hurting more than just you." Evelyn's eyes flashed with anger, but beneath it, there was a flicker of vulnerability. "You don't know anything about me, Dr. Moore, so don't pretend like you do." Jonathan sighed, choosing his next words carefully. "I know what it's like to carry the weight of the past," he said, "to feel like you have to prove something to the world. But holding on to resentment doesn't make you stronger. It only keeps you trapped." For a moment, Evelyn didn't respond. Her gaze dropped to the table, her defenses wavering. But just as quickly as the vulnerability appeared, it was gone, replaced by her usual mask of composure. "If you'll excuse me," she said curtly, standing and brushing past him without another word. Later that evening, Evelyn sat alone in her car, parked in the hospital's underground lot. The confrontation with Jonathan had shaken something loose, memories she had buried long ago. She thought of Corinne, of the afternoons spent at her kitchen table learning algebra equations, of the quiet encouragement Corinne had offered when Evelyn felt like giving up. But those memories were tangled with others, of the snide comments from classmates, of the humiliation she felt when people discovered she relied on a black woman for guidance. Evelyn had vowed to never be seen as weak again, even if it meant distancing herself from the person who had believed in her the most. As she stared out at the darkened lot, Evelyn felt a pang of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: regret. Meanwhile, Brianna visited Corinne again, this time bringing her a small bouquet of flowers. "You've got quite the fighter in your son," Brianna said with a smile, placing the flowers on the bedside table. Corinne's eyes softened. "He gets it from his mum," she joked lightly, though her tone carried a deep pride. Then, her expression grew more serious. "Thank you, Brianna, for everything you've done, for me, for Malik. You've reminded me that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right." Brianna smiled, her resolve strengthened. "That's why I became a nurse," she said, "to help people like you." As she left the room, Brianna couldn't shake the feeling that the tides were beginning to shift. Evelyn's grip on the hospital's culture was slipping, and the truth about her past was starting to surface. But whether that truth would lead to healing or more destruction remained to be seen. The conference room at Atlanta Mercy General was stifling. The air felt heavy with anticipation, each second of silence sharpening the tension that hung in the room. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by a mix of hospital staff, administrators, and senior doctors. At one end sat Sandra Blake, her presence commanding but unreadable. Evelyn Harper, poised and composed, occupied a seat to her right. Across the table sat Brianna Carter, her posture straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite the calm exterior she worked hard to maintain, her pulse raced. This was it, the moment when everything would come to light. Sandra cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "We're here to address a series of incidents involving breaches in hospital protocol," she began, her tone even but edged with authority. Specifically, the situation involving a minor, Malik Hayes, being granted unauthorized access to the patient care area. All eyes turned to Evelyn as she spoke up, her voice calm but laced with barely concealed disdain. "The situation is clear. Ms. Carter allowed a child into a restricted area without proper clearance, disregarding the safety of our patients and staff. This kind of behavior sets a dangerous precedent, one that this hospital cannot afford." Brianna's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to breathe deeply before responding. "Malik Hayes is a 10-year-old boy who walked miles to see his mother, who is gravely ill. He wasn't a threat to anyone. He was just a child who needed compassion, something I believe is at the heart of our profession." Evelyn's lips twitched, a faint smile of mockery crossing her face. "Compassion doesn't excuse breaking the rules, Ms. Carter. Rules exist for a reason, to ensure order and safety. If we allow personal feelings to dictate our actions, we undermine the very foundation of this institution." Sandra held up a hand, cutting off the brewing argument. "Enough," she said firmly. "Before we continue, I'd like to present additional information." She turned to Dr. Jonathan Moore, who had been silent until now, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the exchange. "Dr. Moore, you've reviewed the details of this case. Do you have anything to add?" Jonathan stood, his presence commanding attention. "I do," he said, his voice steady. He pulled out a remote and clicked a button, projecting footage from the hospital's security cameras onto the screen behind him. The video showed Malik sitting outside the hospital lobby, clutching his drawing and looking lost. The scene shifted to Brianna kneeling beside him, her body language radiating concern. It then showed her leading Malik through the hallway, their interaction filled with quiet determination. Finally, the footage ended with a brief glimpse of Malik inside his mother's room, handing her the drawing with a look of pure relief. Jonathan paused, letting the images sink in before he spoke. "What I see here isn't a breach of protocol. I see humanity. I see a nurse going above and beyond to provide care, not just for a patient, but for her family." Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of the evidence. "This doesn't change the fact that rules were broken," she said sharply. "If everyone acted this way, we'd have chaos." Jonathan turned to her, his voice calm but cutting. Rules are important, Evelyn, but so is judgment. Malik Hayes wasn't chaos. He was a child in need of help, and Brianna made a decision that upheld the values of this hospital far more than blindly following protocol ever could. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Sandra leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Doctor, more," she said. "You've given us important context, but there's another matter that needs to be addressed." She turned to Evelyn, her gaze piercing. "I've been made aware of certain complaints about your conduct, Evelyn. Complaints that suggest a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the values we uphold." Evelyn's face paled, but she kept her composure. "I've always acted in the best interests of this hospital," she said stiffly. Sandra didn't flinch. "Perhaps, but there are instances where your actions have crossed the line from professionalism to prejudice. I've reviewed accounts from staff and patients, and I've seen enough to warrant a deeper investigation." Evelyn opened her mouth to protest, but Sandra raised a hand to silence her. "We'll conduct this investigation thoroughly and fairly. In the meantime, I'm placing you on administrative leave." The room erupted in murmurs as Evelyn's mask of control shattered, her lips pressing into a thin line as she rose abruptly. Without a word, she left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Sandra turned her attention back to Brianna. "Ms. Carter," she said, her tone softer but still firm, "you acted with compassion and integrity. While I can't overlook the fact that protocol was broken, I also recognize that your intentions were pure and aligned with the core mission of this hospital. Consider this a formal warning, but also a commendation for your courage." Relief washed over Brianna, though she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She nodded, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "Thank you, Ms. Blake. I'll do my best to continue serving this hospital with both compassion and professionalism." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as they left the conference room together. "You did well," he said quietly. "You stood your ground and made a difference." Brianna looked up at him, a small but genuine smile breaking through. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was Malik. He reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place." Jonathan nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. Sometimes it takes someone like Malik to remind all of us what really matters. As Brianna walked back to her station, she passed by room 317. She paused for a moment, peeking inside to see Malik sitting beside his mother, the drawing still on her bedside table. The sight filled her with a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, small acts of kindness could ripple outward and create change. But somewhere deep in the hospital, Evelyn sat alone in the empty parking lot, her mind racing. The walls she had built around herself for years were beginning to crack, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something she couldn't ignore: doubt. Evelyn Harper sat at her kitchen table, the silence of her small apartment pressing in on her like a heavy blanket. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a monotonous backdrop to the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. She hadn't been to the hospital in days, not since she was placed on administrative leave. The emptiness of her routine left her with nothing but time to reflect, a task she'd spent years avoiding. On the table before her lay an unopened envelope from the hospital administration, its bold logo staring back at her like a challenge. She knew it contained the results of the investigation Sandra had promised. But for now, it remained untouched. Instead, Evelyn's focus was drawn to the small, tattered notebook she had pulled from the back of her closet earlier that morning. It was a relic from another life, a time when she was Evelyn Davis, a scared teenager navigating the chaos of her impoverished neighborhood. The notebook was filled with math problems, carefully written in her younger self's neat handwriting, and notes in a script she recognized immediately: Corinne Hayes's. Evelyn ran her fingers over the faded ink, the words blurring as memories she had buried deep began to resurface. Corinne had been her rock during those turbulent years, patiently guiding her through schoolwork, offering her meals when there wasn't enough food at home, and believing in her when no one else did. And how had Evelyn repaid her? By turning her back on the very person who had lifted her up. The memory of Malik's tear-streaked face outside the hospital flashed in her mind, followed by the image of Corinne lying in her hospital bed. The walls Evelyn had built around herself cracked further, and for the first time in years, tears slipped down her cheeks. The following day, Evelyn stood outside the hospital, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. She had spent the night rehearsing what she would say, but now that she was here, every word seemed to slip away. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway as she approached room 317. She hesitated at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the small window, she could see Corinne sitting up in bed, her frame still frail, but her expression warm as she spoke to Malik. The boy's laughter filled the room, a sound so pure it made Evelyn's throat tighten. Evelyn let out a quiet, derisive laugh, shaking her head. "You see, Sandra, this is exactly what I mean. Rules exist for a reason, but apparently, some of us think we're above them." Brianna turned to Evelyn, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "Rules are important, Evelyn, but they're not meant to strip away humanity. That boy wasn't a threat to anyone. He was just a child trying to see his mom." "And what happens when every child with a sob story wants to waltz into a restricted area?" Evelyn shot back, her tone icy. "We're not running a daycare, Brianna. This is a hospital. We have protocols to maintain order and safety." Brianna's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Order and safety don't mean turning a blind eye to people who need help. Malik wasn't just a sob story. He was a human being, Evelyn. Something I think you've forgotten how to recognize." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Evelyn's carefully constructed facade cracked. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something darker flashing across her face, before she smoothed it back into her usual mask of professionalism. Sandra raised a hand, her tone cutting through the tension. "Enough, both of you." She turned to Brianna, her expression softer but still firm. "I understand your intentions, Brianna, and I appreciate your compassion. But Evelyn does have a point. Rules are in place for a reason. What if something had gone wrong? What if Malik's presence had caused further complications for his mother or other patients?" Brianna hesitated, the weight of Sandra's words pressing down on her. "I understand that," she said finally, her voice quieter but no less resolute. "But sometimes, following the rules to the letter means forgetting the people they're meant to protect. Malik needed someone to see him, to hear him, and I wasn't going to turn my back on him." Sandra studied her for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "That may be true," she admitted, "but the fact remains, you did break protocol, and that's not something I can ignore." Outside the break room, Jonathan Moore paced the hallway, his brow furrowed with concern. He had heard whispers of what was happening: Evelyn's complaint, Sandra's involvement, and Brianna's potential reprimand. Jonathan had worked alongside Brianna long enough to know her heart was in the right place. She had the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it put her at odds with the system. When the door finally opened, Jonathan turned to see Brianna stepping out, her shoulders tense but her expression determined. Evelyn followed close behind, her head held high, her smugness almost tangible. Sandra remained inside, likely processing the heated discussion she'd just mediated. "Brianna," Jonathan called softly, catching her attention. She looked up, surprised but relieved to see him. "Doctor," More. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. I heard what happened. Are you all right? Brianna hesitated, her resolve flickering for just a moment. I'm fine, she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. I didn't expect it to get this messy. Jonathan nodded, his expression thoughtful. Doing the right thing often does, but it's worth it. You did what any good nurse would do, what any good person would do. Brianna managed a small smile, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Thanks, Doctor. More. That means a lot. As Jonathan watched her walk away, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He had seen too many good people get caught in the crossfire of bureaucracy and compassion, and he knew that this wasn't over, not for Brianna, not for Evelyn, and certainly not for the Hayes family. Evelyn Harper strode back to the reception desk, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The air of triumph clung to her as she settled into her chair, but deep inside, a seed of irritation lingered. Brianna Carter's defiance wasn't something she had anticipated, and it gnawed at her sense of control. Evelyn prided herself on being the gatekeeper of order at Atlanta Mercy General, and anything or anyone that challenged her authority was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Meanwhile, Brianna lingered in the hallway outside the break room, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The conversation with Sandra had left her feeling conflicted. She didn't regret helping Malik, not for a second, but the weight of potentially jeopardizing her career loomed heavy over her. Her mind replayed Evelyn's cold, clipped words, each one dripping with disdain. Before she could dwell too long, Jonathan Moore reappeared, his presence steadying. Brianna, he began, his voice calm but firm. You handled yourself well in there, but you need to be prepared for what might come next. Brianna sighed, leaning against the wall. I don't understand how someone like Evelyn can be so blind to the humanity in front of her. It's like she sees people as problems to manage, not lives to care for. Summoning her courage, Evelyn knocked gently on the door. The laughter stopped, and both Corinne and Malik turned toward her. Corinne's expression shifted to one of quiet surprise, while Malik regarded her with cautious curiosity. Evelyn, Corinne said softly, her voice carrying no malice, only curiosity. What brings you here? Evelyn stepped into the room, her usual composure absent. She looked down at Malik, who was watching her intently, then back at Corinne. I wanted to apologize, she said, her voice trembling slightly. For everything. For the way I treated Malik, for the way I've treated you, and for forgetting who I used to be. Corinne's gaze softened, though her expression remained unreadable. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong, she said gently. But what matters is what you do next. Evelyn nodded, her hands gripping her bag tightly. I want to make it right, she said. I don't know how, but I want to try. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn began volunteering with Voices of Hope, a local organization focused on providing resources to underprivileged communities. At first, her presence was met with skepticism. Many of the other volunteers knew her from the hospital and regarded her with suspicion, their whispers following her wherever she went. But Evelyn didn't let it deter her. She threw herself into the work, helping to organize food drives, distributing supplies, and tutoring children in math, something she hadn't done since her time with Corinne. Slowly but surely, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. One afternoon, while helping a young girl solve a math problem, Evelyn was struck by how much the child reminded her of herself. The girl's brow furrowed in concentration, her pencil tapping against the table as she worked through the equation. When she finally solved it, her face lit up with pride. Great job, Evelyn said, her voice warm. The girl beamed at her, and in that moment, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years: genuine fulfillment. As part of her volunteer work, Evelyn also joined a mission trip to a rural village in Ghana, helping to build a school and provide medical care to the community. The experience was transformative. For the first time, Evelyn saw the direct impact of her actions on others' lives. She worked tirelessly, her hands blistered from hours of manual labor, but her heart felt lighter with every wall she helped raise. One evening, as she sat beneath a star-filled sky, a young boy approached her with a piece of paper in his hands. It was a drawing, simple but heartfelt, depicting a sun shining down on a small village. The boy handed it to her with a shy smile. "For you," he said in broken English. That night, as she lay under a blanket of stars, Evelyn thought about how far she had come. For so long, she had lived behind walls of her own making, shielding herself from vulnerability, connection, and change. But now, those walls were crumbling, replaced by something far more fulfilling: the knowledge that her actions, however small, could make a difference. When Evelyn returned to Atlanta, she didn't go straight home. Instead, she found herself standing outside room 317 once again. This time, she carried a gift, a framed copy of the drawing the boy in Ghana had given her. Corinne Hayes looked up as Evelyn entered, her face lighting up with surprise. "Evelyn?" she said warmly. "Back so soon?" Evelyn smiled, setting the frame on the bedside table. "I wanted to give this to you," she said. "It's from a boy I met on my trip. It reminded me of Malik's drawing, and it reminded me of you." Corinne's eyes softened, her hand reaching out to touch the frame. "It's beautiful," she said. "Thank you." As Evelyn sat beside her, they spoke quietly, their conversation easy and unguarded for the first time. For Evelyn, it wasn't just an act of redemption. It was a step towards something she hadn't dared to hope for: healing. Evelyn Harper stood outside the Hayes family's small apartment, clutching a brightly colored frame in her hands. The gentle hum of the Atlanta streets provided a quiet backdrop to her thoughts. It had been weeks since her return from Ghana, and while her journey of redemption was far from over, she felt ready to take this next step. She knocked lightly on the door, her heart thudding in anticipation. The door swung open to reveal Malik, his face lighting up with a wide grin when he saw her. "Miss Evelyn!" he exclaimed, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in." Evelyn entered, her gaze falling on Corinne, who was sitting in her usual spot near the window. Though still recovering, her complexion had improved, and her smile radiated warmth. "Evelyn," Corinne greeted, her voice soft but full of welcome. "This is a nice surprise." Evelyn returned the smile, stepping forward to hand Malik the frame. "I wanted you to have this," she said. "It's a drawing from a boy I met in Ghana. He reminded me so much of you, Malik. His courage, his kindness. It was like seeing you in a different part of the world." Malik's eyes widened as he took the frame, his fingers tracing the colorful lines of the sun and flowers. "It's amazing," he whispered. "Thank you." Evelyn crouched to his level, her voice gentle. "You're going to do incredible things, Malik. I know it. And whenever you doubt yourself, remember that there's a whole world out there that can be changed by someone like you." In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's connection with the Hayes family deepened. She visited regularly, helping Malik with his schoolwork and sharing stories of her time in Africa. Malik, in turn, shared his dreams of becoming an artist and using his work to inspire others. True to his word, Malik poured himself into his passion, and his efforts didn't go unnoticed. One of his drawings, a vivid depiction of unity among people of all colors, was featured in a local art exhibit. The community rallied around him, and soon he received a scholarship to an art program that would nurture his talent further. Evelyn watched with quiet pride, knowing that Malik's future was bright. But her journey didn't end there. She continued her volunteer work with Voices of Hope, eventually leading another mission trip to rural Africa. Standing in a dusty village square, she handed out bags of rice and beans to families in need, their smiles a reflection of the connection she now sought to build in every corner of her life. As she worked, she carried Malik's spirit with her, the determination of a boy who refused to give up, and the reminder of how love and compassion could create ripples far beyond what she'd ever imagined. This story is a powerful reminder that redemption and growth are always possible. Evelyn Harper's journey shows us that no matter how far we've strayed, we can choose a different path, one filled with love, empathy, and a commitment to make the world a better place. Malik's determination and Corinne's unwavering love prove that even in the face of adversity, we can rise above and inspire others to do the same. What do you think of Evelyn's transformation and Malik's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on how small acts of kindness can create profound change. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll ensure you never miss another moving tale that reminds us of the beauty and strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching and being a part of our journey to spread positivity and love. Together, let's keep inspiring change, one story at a time.